Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live, interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big questions facing researchers, policymakers, and planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions in the study of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, the University of Warwick, UK, American University in the United States, and their partners. Today's live streamed production is entitled The Challenge of Forced Displacement. My name is Scott Hamilton, Research Coordinator at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator for today's session. A warm welcome to all participants joining us today in the audience. We'd like to invite you to direct any questions you have to the panelists using the Q&A function of your Zoom page, and we'll do our best to put your questions back to the panelists, particularly in the latter half of today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those in the audience who are tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the actions we take to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on the historical legacies of and the continuous processes of displacement and colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land, and Indigenous people have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, which is on the traditional territory of the Atawandran, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated and the processes of displacement that shape it in everything that we do, including Global Insights. We recognize the direct connection between our topic today, our local history, and current colonial policies that continue to displace First Nations people even today. So to start us off on today's important conversation, let's turn to our distinguished panel. Bree Akeeson is an Associate Professor of Social Work, the Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Global Adversity and Wellbeing, and the Associate Director of the Centre for Research on Security Practices at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. Her research ranges from micro-level understandings of the experiences of families impacted by war and displacement to macro-level studies on social service and mental health system strengthening. Jessie DiSalvatore is Associate Professor in Political Science and Peace Studies at the University of Warwick. Her research focuses on UN peace missions and their impact on political and criminal violence. Jesse Raibo works on rights and vulnerabilities of resource-dependent populations in sub-Saharan Africa. He teaches environmental political economy in the School of International Service at American University and is a visiting Guggenheim Fellow at the New York University Wagner School and the City University of New York Graduate Center Anthropology Program for 2018-2019. Thank you once again, everyone, for sharing your insights with us today. So to begin, according to the UN Refugee Agency, there are currently 80 million people in the world who have had to flee their homes because of conflict or persecution. So this is the equivalent of about 1% of the world's population. There's a broad consensus that the numbers of displaced peoples will continue to grow, not only because of protracted conflicts, but also because of threats such as climate change. So Bree, turning to you first, how exactly has conflict and the nature of forced displacement been changing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Scott, for having me here. I'm so happy to have this conversation with my colleagues today. The first thing I want to talk about in terms of how conflict has changed is, I guess, the biggest change is that conflict is more protracted. So back in 1990, average conflict lasted about 20 years, while now it's about 40 years. If we think about conflict in Myanmar, the conflict between Israelis, Palestinians, and Israel and Lebanon, the conflict in Kashmir, these have all lasted over 70 years with no end in sight. So displaced populations become stuck in limbo for generations with this protracted nature of conflict. Conflicts are less intense, so major wars are less common and minor conflicts are more common. Conflicts between states are rare, so we're seeing more internal armed conflicts between domestic groups. And this has to do with unresolved regional tensions and things like that. In 2013, there were 0 interstate conflicts, while there were 33 internal armed conflicts. So much more, kind of these internal conflicts that are within the borders of a country. Conflicts are also more fragmented and complex, which leads extra elements of challenge to populations who are displaced. For example, the Syrian war, when it first started, there were approximately 8 fighting groups at the start. And now there's about several thousand fighting groups that are vying for power, vying for control in different areas. And this is a really interesting kind of change in terms of how conflict has changed over the years. There's also different forms of violence that result in forced displacement. So there's scarcity of resources that are exacerbated by climate change, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. There's things like organized crime and drug-related violence, which is primarily in the Americas, which is a whole new type of cause of forced displacement. Something my colleague Andrew Basso and I are looking at is the violence of domicide, which is the intentional destruction of home in the context of war, and how that contributes to forced displacement. So what does that mean to have someone's home lost or home destroyed in the context of war, and how that leads to forced displacement? And then I'll just mention two other things about conflict today. International cooperation is becoming more rare. This might have to do with the fact that conflicts are, within the state and not between states. But this decreases the potential for the prevention and resolution of conflict. And then also there is a greater understanding from researchers, from scholars, from humanitarian workers on the biopsychosocial impact of conflict and forced displacement. So that's a really great thing that's happened recently, where we understand it's not just casualties and trauma, but it's other mental health issues like anxiety, depression, loss of home, loss of livelihoods. And again, this has to do with the protracted nature of conflict now, that this is happening for generations. So we're starting to look at that as a research community.
Thank you. And Jesse, considering the protracted and the multifaceted nature of these conflicts, or sorry, Jessica, considering the protracted nature of these conflicts, how exactly is the UN trying to address the issue of forced displacement, particularly in the context of peace operations authorized by the UN Security Council?
Yeah, well, first, Scott, let me thank you for having me today as well. I'm very happy to join this conversation, which I think is a very timely and important one. And in terms of what the UN and particularly Security Council have been doing to address forced displacement, well, since the 1999, the UN is increasingly starting prioritizing protection of civilians in its actions, particularly protection of what they call vulnerable groups. So if you read the resolutions, these oftentimes refer to vulnerable groups, which of course, displaced people are a category that belongs to the vulnerable group category. Now, the Security Council in particular has acted to address forced displacement in different ways or from different aspects of displacement. For example, at least it tries to prevent displacement, then protect displaced people, then also enhance humanitarian access, for example, for displaced populations, and finally also potentially to create solutions and conditions for the return of these displaced peoples. Of course, these are just goals that the Security Council has in mind, and it's taking different actions to pursue each of these. In case of prevention, what prevention looks like in the case of the Security Council action, it's mostly done by condemning and recalling principles of humanitarian laws and in very general terms, right? Also referring to state responsibilities mostly. So it's mostly political language that tries to condemn states when civilians are forcibly displaced. The remaining 3 actions, so protection, humanitarian access, and potential solutions for returns, these are more commonly integrated, I think, in the context of peacekeeping operations, of UN-authorized peacekeeping operations. Now, these missions nowadays have become much more long-term and particularly ambitious. Currently, they have many different tasks, missions in South Sudan, missions in Congo. They have a huge number of tasks that includes also the protection and access to humanitarian relief for displaced populations. So what peacekeepers do on the ground actually is that they try to provide security to displaced populations, but also to humanitarian actors, so basically enabling their work, the work of both UN agencies, but also other NGOs that provides reliefs to these groups. In some countries, the UN, like in South Sudan, for example, they've set up IDP, so internally displaced people camps scattered throughout the country. And I believe that when we think about what the UN is doing in relation to forced displacement, we may want to consider the differences between how the Security Council is dealing with this compared to the General Assembly, for example. So the Security Council has not been condemning specific issues, specific instances of forced displacement in specific countries, has been much more general in the language that is used in its resolutions, while the General Assembly, on the other hand, has repeatedly discussed these issues and condemned them much more overtly compared to the Security Council, referring specifically not only to countries or states or governments that are associated with violations against civilians that forced their displacement, but also in relations to the prohibition of displacement that was also included in the UN guiding principles ultimately. So I think there may be an important distinction that we want to draw here, when rather than thinking of the UN as a whole, maybe distinguishing here a little bit between the different politics within the different components of the UN system in this case.
Excellent, thank you. And turning from scholars studying the UN, from the UN to scholars studying the UN, Jesse, most of your work has been on climate and social vulnerability in sub-Saharan Africa. So what inspired you as a scholar to work on displacement and migration?
Yeah, hello everybody. I really don't study migration. I did one study in which it figured very largely, and that was because on April the 15th, 2015, April the 19th, 2015, a boat sank off of Lampedusa with 729 young African men on it. There were 29 survivors. And I was looking at climate change and its effect in the Sahel. And these young men were all being called climate refugees, climate migrants. And many of them came from villages I've spent 35 years working in. So I went back and I talked to their parents, their brothers and sisters, their friends, and asked a very simple question: why did they go? And none of them spoke about the weather. None of them spoke about crops or harvests. They spoke about many things, and I'll get to those later. But really, I was disturbed by the labeling of climate refugee, because they were not migrating because of climate. And this in itself is very important. And the word refugee is important too. As Jessica knows, talking of the Security Council, a refugee is somebody who is in fact being a victim of violence by their own government. Climate change is not their own government. So somebody is not a climate refugee if they're migrating in a technical sense. Somebody, of course, has got to deal with these people and help them out. But it falls into a very different basket. And what I really liked in listening to Bree is the complexity of causality can't be reduced to resource scarcity. And in fact, the Tad Homer-Dixon type of narrative has been well disproven. People like Amartya Sen have shown that hunger is not about absolute scarcity, it's about distribution. And so the other kinds of things that Bree brought up, like crime, domicide, violence of various sorts, structural and direct, and all kinds of economic exploitation, seem to me to be behind the migrations that I began looking at. And my purpose in looking at migration in that case was to unpack the causes, because I find the misdiagnosis to be damaging.
Thank you, Jesse. You bring up some interesting points about climate. And so I'd like to do a bit of a deeper dive into the migration conflict climate nexus here. So Bree, how exactly has climate change shifted our understanding of forced displacement and the varying impacts on those affected and the humanitarian response? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I mean, Jesse, you bring up such good points, and I'm so glad you're on this panel. My area has traditionally been conflict, war, and things like that, but climate change has become such a part of that conversation. So I've kind of been diving into that topic as well, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this this nexus as well. As you know, the relationship between climate change and conflict is much more complicated than a cause and effect. I think we want to see, okay, climate change causes conflict. I mean, researchers cannot find that cause and effect. It's just much more complicated. There was a research team led by Catherine Mack who found that climate change has had modest effects on past conflicts, but her team also found that these effects are expected to get much larger in the future. So it's something that we're keeping an eye on as well. And I think that it is agreed commonly that climate change is what's known as a threat multiplier. So it adds stress to already stressed societies, and therefore it serves as a catalyst for conflict. So the human consequences could be things like food insecurity, reduced crop yields, and increased migration. So this idea of climate change contributing to mixed migration, contributing to cross-border movements of people, including refugees, victims of trafficking, and people who are just seeking better lives and opportunities, is becoming a bigger factor, which really complicates the way that we address forced migration. So we tend to, we have, defined refugee as somebody who's fleeing their home country for a well-founded fear of persecution. But how do we grapple with, people who are migrating or displaced for multiple reasons? So the designation, legal status, and rights of those who are displaced by environmental factors are really unclear and contested, which makes them more vulnerable. And it creates a more of humanitarian crises for these people. I'll just end with one example, the Rohingya in Bangladesh. The Rohingya are a stateless ethnic group. They're considered one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. They've experienced recently an ethnic cleansing campaign, horrific acts of violence, the burning of their homes and villages, sexual violence at the hands of the Burmese military and local Buddhist Burmese population. 700,000 Rohingya have been displaced to Bangladesh, which is one of the largest and fastest moving groups in recent history. And Bangladesh itself is considered ground zero for the global climate crisis. Most of the refugees are living in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee resettlement, but that particular area is vulnerable to cyclones, flooding, and landslides. So every year we're hearing about how these populations are living in precarious locations that are being further eroded due to climate change. So these populations who've already fled war, conflict, ethnic cleansing, are subjected to subsequent displacement and multiple levels of loss. So I think that's a really good example of how climate change and conflict are very much interrelated and super complicated.
Absolutely. And Jesse, you hinted in your last answer that there's a lot more to unpack here, and it's a lot more complicated than we might first assume, and than what we read in the newspapers. And there's indeed much written about climate migration and from the Sahel and about climate refugees. Now, your work indicates that you think there are other reasons that farmers are currently migrating. So can you tell us more about why exactly people are migrating from the Sahelian villages that you work in?
It's very, very subtle and complex. It turns out, despite being called climate refugees and climate migrants, rainfall in the Sahel has increased in the last 20 years. Crops have increased, and most of the people go when they have surplus, not when they're so poor that they can't stay. So the narrative of climate stress doesn't even apply in this circumstance, counter to most people's intuitive understanding. But I wanted to kind of address that in a sense with respect to Bree's comment. People are not vulnerable to cyclones or droughts. They're vulnerable to damages, hunger and famine. And they are located, in the case of the Rohingya, they are exposed because of where they are being put or allowed to be. And you have to understand the circumstance. So for me, in my Sahelian arena where I work, when I've spoken to young people and families, because the economy is shifting and people are depending more on remittances, you now have a class formation of those with and those without remittances. Those without remittances, when the young men grow up and want to marry, nobody wants their children to marry these young men. So they can't marry, they can't come of age. Those with remittances, their young daughters are being married off to migrants in a polygamous fashion. So 2 or 3 young girls are being, and I say girls, they're 13, 14, 15, married off to somebody in Europe. And they don't have any say over this. It's arranged marriages, but the men don't come except for 3 weeks a year to visit. And so what's going on is the young men who have no wives and the young wives who have no men, guess what they're doing? They're having a good time. But this is causing pregnancies, causing divorces, causing conflict. And you have a kind of strange situation in which some people feel more stable because of remittances and others feel more marginal. And they tend to be the ones trying to migrate, not as successfully as those with people in their family getting remittances, because those with the remittances are more embedded in the networks. So that would be just one example. There are many other things, low prices for corn, for maize, that is, for peanuts, fixed prices on peanuts, oligopsony prices on charcoal. So these people work their tuchuses off, that's a Yiddish word, and they don't get enough to survive. They live below subsistence or at the edge. And so when an ordinary dry period comes along, yes, they go hungry. And the anxiety that they live is extraordinary. You talk to a young man and they say to you, I cannot feed my children. I can't sleep at night. You know, this doesn't make for somebody wanting to, quote, stay back on the farm. So how do you keep them back on the farm is not by lowering or ratcheting down their prices. So I think we have to look at all of these things.
So you're mentioning some very complex and even maybe some unexpected variables that surely make managing such issues very difficult. So Jessica, what kind of evidence do we have regarding the contribution of UN interventions to managing displacements and forced displacements like this?
Well, I think for the reason mentioned very clearly by Bree and Jesse, it's very difficult actually to measure both the causes of conflict, but also the resolution of the conflict that may cause that displacement. So where do you set the bar? How do you define the benchmark that allows you to make that evaluation? Now, for policymakers, that bar can be pretty low sometimes. In other cases, it can be pretty ambitious. So I think the answer to the question really depends on how you want to define that success. You can think, for example, at levels of violence. So if violence decreases, you can think that the intervention is successful. But of course, that measurement in this specific case, it basically misses all the great points that Jesse and Bree mentioned. So it doesn't capture anything related to the psychological trauma or the damages that people are vulnerable to. So in this case, you're completely missing that part of the picture. So in general, and I think that we do not know a lot about what the actions that the Security Council or the UN has been carrying out, how much of a relief they bring to, in terms especially of preventing, for example, forced displacement. I think most of our knowledge is very case specific ultimately, and we do not have yet evaluations, especially from the UN itself, but also I think in the research community, especially if I think about the research community I'm part of, which is the one that uses data to evaluate, for example, policy implementation. I don't think we have at this stage an answer to whether these actions, these interventions are effective or not. However, I think there are some other insights from existing research on peacekeeping effectiveness that maybe can tell us something, can give us an idea of what would be a preliminary assessment of these interventions in relation to forced displacement. And I should say once again that this is largely based on what the analysis of data tell us about peacekeepers' work. And so conclusions, as you can all imagine, it's very much dependent on the quality of the data, but more importantly, on the assumptions that we make on what the data is telling us and the models that we use when you try to analyze those data. So keeping these caveats in mind, I think these are very key. I think there's been an increasing consensus so far that peacekeeping operation can bring about two key benefits in the literature, in the research that analyze the conflict data ultimately. So first, you can make the argument that if two reasonably similar countries are at civil wars, the one hosting a UN military deployment will have fewer deaths. So you see a decreasing number of deaths on a monthly basis, basically. And ultimately, you can conclude that peacekeeping can save lives. Secondly, households that are in a country that is in a civil war tend to be better off in locations proximate to peacekeepers. And better off in this case means they have better access to food, they tend to consume more, they have access to local markets because of the presence of peacekeepers that tends to revive local economies sometimes, and they also seem to be better off psychologically. Now, we could expect that better security and better living conditions should reduce the rate of displacement potentially, and even forced displacement. This is, of course, trying to extrapolating from other findings that tell us something about conflict dynamics onto forced displacement. I think in theory, we could expect that maybe blue helmets can bring about these additional benefits of potentially creating conditions that maybe reduce the rate of forced displacement and the rate of displacement, whether forced or not. But I think evidence exactly on this point is limited. I think the only good news now is that I know about some research projects. I'm part of some of these research projects that are working on it. So we're on it, and hopefully we will be able to say something, I think, more accurate soon. But I think at the moment, it's difficult to make clear conclusions and policy recommendations on these things.
Well, thank you. We've been talking a lot about the effects of displacement that we see, policy recommendations, studies that reveal the evidence for effects, but we can't have an effect without a cause. And there's a lot of talk about addressing the root causes of displacement, but it's arguably quite superficial what exactly these causes are. So collectively, do we fully understand the reasons why people are actually on the move? And so Jesse, turning to you first, what do you think are the reasons that many discourses link migration to things like climate change?
This is, again, the wrong diagnoses are often made. And Jessica just said it quite clearly that data matter, so do assumptions, the frameworks we have. So Bree used the language of the vulnerability to climate events. But in fact, that language implicitly has within it the assumption that the climate event is doing the work. And so we need to think very carefully about our assumptions. And it's very common. I mean, we all use that kind of language. And in this case, I think we see the argument about climate change being made because climate advocates, bless their hearts, they're doing the right thing in many ways because climate change is a horror. They want to bring attention to the issue. So they say climate refugees, there are going to be billions of them. But the reason that they do this is kind of horrifying. It's because xenophobia makes it so this discourse plays very well in Europe and the United States. So if you say that a bunch of colored people, Black people are going to be coming across your borders, Latinos are coming across your borders, because of climate change, people will be against climate change. And I find the mobilization of this xenophobia simply unacceptable. I think we need to understand climate change as, was mentioned, a multiplier effect Bree talked about, but even more to understand that the very conditions that make people leave their homes in Latin America, the violence in certain places, it is rarely about crop failures. And even when it is, it's very marginal. We need to bring to the center those kinds of causality and try and undermine the discourses that bring attention to something in the far future and ask, why can't we look at what's already here and painful and unacceptable? And why do we have to go out the projection lines of climate change to deal with pain and suffering in the future, which if we deal with today, I would argue we'll be much better prepared for future climate stress multipliers.
Well, I know many of us look to organizations like the UN to stop these threat multipliers at their root source, correct? So, Jessica, turning back to you, it seems that the UN peace missions mandates expect their operations to create these foundational conditions for the safe return of refugees and displaced. But what does this actually mean in practice on the ground?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because as I mentioned, I mean, the UN missions, the peacekeeping operations, they do have a mandate to create conditions for and support the safe and voluntary return of displaced people. So in theory, they have a mandate to do so. Doing that in practice is much more complicated and complex, also because, I mean, as it was already mentioned, identifying the root causes of displacement, removing them and assuming that that's enough for return to happen, it's of course overstretched. So it's probably, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not sufficient to remove the reasons that that determine displaced in the first place to ensure return, because returning may involve a variety of reasons that make it not just the opposite of living. And furthermore, return, it's not itself the goal. The goal has to be, of course, voluntary return, but also a durable, sustainable, and dignified return. And in terms of, so this means that in terms of the challenges that returnees have to face, and so peacekeepers have to face when they try to implement these mandates that the Security Council equip them with, besides the intuitive challenges, such as maybe restoring some degree of security, maybe helping the economy starting recovering, returnees face also other important obstacles that are related to, for example, social cohesion, but more importantly, the issues, of course, of house, land, and property. Now, what this means is that in terms of the social reintegration of the returnees, this is something that it's very difficult, for example, for peacekeepers to address and to tackle, because there's oftentimes a stigma attached to those who left in their communities, whether forcibly or not. So removing that stigma becomes very difficult, because it requires some mediation and potential reconciliation activities that military contingents cannot really carry out in the best way, probably. And secondly, in terms of property, land, and housing, and I think Scott referred to some of these issues before, these are often key to those returning to their own communities after having been displaced for years, especially if land, in some cases, is attached to their own identities. Now, in many cases, what happens is that when returnees come back, if they want to come back, of course, property is either occupied, or it's been destroyed, or it's been officially reallocated by the government, which means that the conditions that really can make the return safe, sustainable, and dignified, as I mentioned, are numerous and likely maybe even more complex, or complex to a different degrees compared to those that cause displacement in the first place. And at Warwick, we have an ongoing project at the moment that tries to understand a little bit something about whether social cohesion and successful reintegration strategies can be pursued in the context of peacekeeping operations, or whether this needs to be done maybe by someone else, right? Maybe the peacekeeping operations, even if they have the mandate to do so, maybe they're not the one. We shouldn't maybe be requesting them. The Security Council shouldn't be asking them to pursue these goals, especially if they can, in a way, maybe potentially backfire even. So if we think about true reintegration of returnees and all the complex motivation that caused displacement in the first place, and then determine return later on, I think it may be also, I think we need to be very careful in equipping military contingents with these specific tasks.
There is a disconnect you're pointing out between the implementation of something on the ground in practice versus the ethics and the guiding principles, the best intentions that might put these into movement to begin with. So turning to Bree now, and on this topic, 5 years ago, the United Nations Secretary General issued a report for the World Humanitarian Summit, stating that, quote, "Preserving the humanity and dignity of affected people in all circumstances must drive our individual and collective action," end quote. So how can the humanitarian community actually uphold these principles when responding to something as complicated as forced displacement?
Yeah, humanitarian responses traditionally have focused and tend to focus on basic needs. So things like food, shelter, and health, which are absolutely critical in a first line response. But I think what gets lost sometimes is that being displaced is an experience where one's dignity may be completely undermined. For example, how refugees, how displaced people are housed, where they're living, the conditions that they face in countries of transit or countries of resettlement. Or as Jessica mentioned, the dignity of return. You know, those things are not really commonly talked about. So there was a report from ODI in 2019 that found that dignity is frequently invoked in humanitarian work with displaced populations, but it is not clear what dignity is, how it's defined, because it can be defined differently by different people, and how it is enacted. The report also found that factors influencing whether affected populations view a humanitarian response as dignified include the situation from which they fled, the location where they fled to, the location where they are currently either displaced or in transit or so forth, and the length of displacement. And this really resonates with my research with Syrian families living in Lebanon. Most of the families I've worked with have a strong attachment to their country of origin. Their connection to Syria is so strong that it comes up in every conversation. If we're talking about Lebanon, they talk about it in comparison to Syria. They talk about how they're treated so poorly within Lebanon. And they talk about, many of them talk about this so much that they comment that they would rather return to the violence in Syria than live with the indignity of living in Lebanon. And then this protracted nature of conflict, where this is dragged on for much longer than people anticipated, it's really contributing to a sense of hopelessness, which, you know, is connected to dignity. So I think in terms of how can the humanitarian response enact dignity and kind of look at this element, I think listening to affected populations to determine their needs and input is really important. And this can inform effective and dignified project design and implementation. There's a kind of understanding the culturally relevant understandings of the experiences of affected populations, investing in programs that create self-reliance and encourage participation, engaging the community to build the shelters, you know, and asking them how should we create this camp, for example. I think that's really important, and that's harnessing the strengths of the local population, the displaced population, national, regional, and international actors. And I think ultimately it's about ensuring relevance for local communities, for displaced populations, and also meaningful ways to build ownership. Now, I say all this with a caveat that this is so much easier said, so much easier written in a report than actually enacted. But I think that's the challenge that we face in humanitarian responses to displaced populations. How can we actually make this happen in reality?
For sure. I know as an international community, we're getting better at responding. But as an international community, we're also quite poor at prevention. So we see threats and challenges coming down the pipeline, but we're finding it harder and harder to convince governments to act until there's actually a crisis. So what is currently being done to prevent mass exoduses of people because of conflict or environmental pressures or some combination of the two? So Jessica, turning to you first, is it possible to evaluate the effectiveness of peace operations in terms of reducing forced displacement and supporting voluntary and safe return?
So that's an important question, I think, to ask, because this completely depends on what we mean with effectiveness. So evaluating something requires also to first define what that something is, and that is not easy at all. It's not easy in the case of conflict. It's not easy in the case of forced displacement. So as I've mentioned before, some studies have tried to measure the effectiveness of peace operation in terms, for example, of monthly reported conflict-related deaths. So if this is the benchmark, and you can compare cases with and without peacekeepers credibly, you can conclude that missions save lives. So this is what basically this research tells us. Now, in the case of displacement, what would this look like? Maybe from the perspective of the missions, if you use a similar benchmark, success would be maybe reducing the number of displacement or ensuring a higher number of people get access to humanitarian relief. And the same for refugees. So missions may define success based, for example, on growing rates of returns. But again, I think these are very low thresholds. to define success, because it basically ignores the sustainability, the dignity, the safety of these returns, and the long-term perspectives of these returns. Of course, displaced people can decide also to settle somewhere else, so they don't have necessarily to return. But there seems to be sometimes an implicit understanding that returns itself is a signal of success. So it's like you're addressing that problem. And so they try sometimes to encourage strongly returns, maybe without really considering whether conditions on the ground allowed this dignified and safe return ultimately. I think the key problem for some researchers has been that in some cases, the data, such as, for example, the number of those who leave and those who return, is not only lacking. So for some, the problem is that this data is lacking. So for example, it's inconsistently collected across different cases, maybe not consistently over time, which makes it complicated to evaluate success. But I think that really the problem is that this may simply not be the data that we need. We may want to consider displaced people experience, how they experience their status, how they're treated in the communities that temporarily host them. And we try to getting at that. At the University of Warwick, we have this project where we try to understand, for example, the perception of host communities. How do they perceive displaced people in terms of security or economic threats, or nothing, right? Or nothing related to this. And simply looking at the flows of people that move around the country to assess effectiveness hides these dynamics that are crucial, I think, to inform better policies ultimately.
Jesse, what are some of the effects of climate migration discourses on policy and practice? Is it good to signal that these people are climate migrants, as some call them? Or what will happen to them as we see climate certainly becoming worse and more volatile in the future?
As I think I said earlier, I don't think it's good to call them climate migrants. There was a question in the chat about Syria and environmental stress. I don't think these people are migrating because of environmental stress. You see places with the exact same ecological conditions, some with and some without migration. The difference is in investments by government, violence by subnational parties, economic exploitation. And so for me, the question is, it comes back in a sense to, I think, things that both Bree and Jessica said. We need to be there. We need to be talking to people. We need to be doing the research and understanding what people see as the causes of their crisis, but not just through their own eyes. We also need to do triangulation to understand what stresses there are and where they come from. People's own narratives are not always accurate, as we know. And so for me, I think we need to bring the focus to, in my region, wages in farming, or prices really of products, social services. So for example, medical services in my area are ostensibly free, provided by the government. Walk in that hospital, you'll be charged market rates. That's a distinction between law and practice, but nobody's bothering to enforce. Same with veterinarian services. And these leave already precarious farmers feeling a bit exasperated. And when someone walks in and says, "You think it's bad now, climate change is coming," how do you think a young farmer feels about their future? It's an anxiety multiplier. And I don't think it is necessary to do that. I think we need to really focus on the everyday struggles that people are faced with. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. No, it was great. And Bree, what exactly is the role of mobility in the lives of those who are forcibly displaced?
So we tend to think of displaced populations as on the move, and in a lot of cases they are on the move, but many are waiting in place and in this like liminal space. They're just waiting to either go back home, waiting to go back to someplace that's more, or waiting to move to another country of resettlement that's more safe. You know, they're not able to go back home because of the violence, and they're not able to move to another more desirable location because of, you know, legal frameworks or just a multitude of factors. they might be stuck because of not having enough money, for example, not having access to legal representation, so forth. But we know that mobility is also a contributor to well-being. So mobility leads to access to services like healthcare. It means that children can attend school. It means that families can visit other family members, which is really critical to well-being. So my point, I guess, for this question is, I think that we have to think of mobility as a right, and we have to consider mobility as an element, along the lines of shelter, food and water, legal representation, and so forth for displaced populations.
Oh, thank you. All right, well, turning to our last round of panel questions here. We'll call it the lightning round because we have about 60 seconds for each answers. But it has to do with the international community and whether or not we can actually devise holistic solutions to help manage these challenges of forced displacements in ways that respect the human rights of those who have been forced to flee their homes and their addresses, and they've been forced to confront the root causes of these displacements. So Jessica, in 60 seconds or less, how does the international community ensure coordination of different tools and across different actors in support of displaced populations?
Well, my understanding of that short answer is that it doesn't, in the sense that basically there are numerous international actions taking place at the same moment to force displacement to tackle forced displacement in different ways, but they do not really act in coordination. For example, it's often the case that peacekeeping missions operate in the same exact fields as other UN agencies, for example, UNHCR, IOM, but also they operate alongside humanitarian actors that, for example, Bree was talking about before, NGOs, or even development actors, such as the World Bank, if you wish to make that kind of distinction. Now, this peace, humanitarian, development nexus, this triple nexus, these three different policy worlds, may be working in the same context, but they really do so in coordination, and this creates a lot of inefficiency, the application of efforts that are not just bad per se, organizationally speaking, they basically go basically at the expenses of those that these interventions would aim to help. And I think a question here could be whether the UN should be the one maybe reducing these coordination issues and possibly facilitating a better coordination work across these different international interventions at the intersection between peace, humanitarian, and development actions. This triple nexus, I think there's more attention right now to this triple nexus in the policy making area, but I think maybe in terms of research-wise, I think we're still considering these issues most of the time as separate.
All right, the UN is straddling the nexus. Thank you. Jesse, turning to you, what can, in 60 seconds or less, what can development agencies and governments possibly do to reduce the precarity of Sahelian farmers?
It's too big a question for 60 seconds or 60 days. It is very simple. It's a constant struggle. We researchers have a role in holding these institutions accountable. We will never hold them accountable. It will be a process in which we always try and make them more accountable, but they will never be fully accountable. The question is, how do you create a ground up, and I don't mean this in a sort of populist sense, understanding from the perspective of the problems faced and the priorities on the ground, response from above. And that requires a dialogue. And it goes from climate modelers to the ground. I'm doing a project at Columbia University with climate modelers, looking at the causes of migration, and they are understanding. They're really getting it. They're getting away from the climate caused everything. And they're seeing migration very differently. I think we researchers need to be in that constant dialogue and to use it to blame, shame, and hold accountable those who are trying to do good but paving the wrong road.
Thank you. And Bree, another 60-day question in 60 seconds. How has technology changed the lives of people who are forcibly displaced, and how can technology be harnessed to assist them?
Well, technology has made lives more difficult and changed the nature of conflict in terms of things like drone strikes being used on populations, which is really a new phenomenon. The other kind of technology that I can think of is social media, which has played a role in disseminating xenophobic speech and inciting violence in certain contexts and conflicts. At its simplest, technology can actually be really helpful. It means that people who are forcibly displaced can stay in touch with their family members. They can receive remittances. From a human rights perspective, technology is really helpful in sharing stories with a wider audience. I'm thinking of the white helmets in Syria, or documenting human rights violations. B'Tselem is an organization in Israel that documents rights violations against Palestinians, and home demolitions have been documented by human rights organizations in Syria and in Myanmar. There's also community mapping programs, which have been really helpful for populations. There's a project called the Aleppo Project in Syria, which documents people's homes and community in Aleppo before they left, before the war destroyed it. And they're trying to kind of capture a vision of the future for when they can rebuild. So very hopeful uses of technology. And I'll end by saying we do have to be cautious about technological solutions that provide quick fixes. Technology doesn't always address the long-term and complex political, social, economic drivers of crisis. There may also be access issues in terms of gender. So, men, in my research, for example, men are the ones who have the smartphones and the women in the family do not. And then also challenges related to the safekeeping of data that we have on smartphones, for example, or global imagery.
So we have a pile of great audience questions coming in, but we have time for just one. And I'll ask our panelists to keep their answers as brief and as succinct as possible. So turning to the audience, so the question: about 85% of displaced peoples are hosted by countries in the global south, many of which are amongst the poorest in the world and under considerable environmental strain. For example, prior to the Syrian civil war, Jordan was the second poorest country in the world for water per capita, and the arrival of the Syrians put tremendous strain on the water system. So what can be done to help countries like Jordan that are shouldering a huge financial and environmental burden when caring for refugees? So preferably in 30 seconds or less, a couple sentences of advice. And why don't we start with Jessica, and then we'll go to Bree and then Jesse. So Jessica.
Yeah, sure. So very briefly, I think this speaks again to the possibly the triple nexus issue that I mentioned before, in the sense that to address such a complex issue, you may need to work at different levels, right, in different policy domains. And some countries, in fact, I think there are some studies showing that some countries try also, for example, they expect, for example, peacekeeping missions to be successful at reducing refugee flows. So sometimes that may motivate some countries to contribute to this mission, exactly because they expect to be better able then to manage those flows. But the thing is that these flows happen anyway. So I think in terms of preventing, we probably are not doing, and I mean, probably this is a problem of prevention rather than trying to address problems that are so substantively complicated to address. And I think that's where the policy world, especially the UN, could be much more prevention rather than trying to work, on once displacement happens.
Thank you. Bree, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's another really complicated question. I would say, I guess a short answer would be the importance of humanitarian interventions supporting the local community, the local host community. And this is something that's been, realized within the humanitarian initiatives. Originally it was, a refugee population in a new community, and this refugee population would be getting healthcare and education and all these things. And the local community is like, why are we not getting these things? And so there's resentment that grows. We still see this. I mean, I'm seeing this in my research in Lebanon, a very kind of a country that's struggling before the influx of Syrian refugees, and you get a lot of resentment in that way. So I think that interventions have to provide services for the local community as well as the population that's displaced. And I think the UN's realized that. I think they're trying to work on it. It means more money. It's harder to coordinate, but I think it's so critical.
Thank you. Jesse, another 60-day answer in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds, I don't agree with the premise of the question as a sort of ecological determinist premise. But it seems to me, and I really am not in this arena, it seems to me that the refugee camp model has got to go. People need to be integrated into communities and treated as if they were human. Very simple. People cannot live that way. And it is partly the narratives of xenophobia that need to be confronted, but also work needs to go into the production of economies locally that can absorb these people in a productive way that is not going to conflict with local needs and aspirations.
Thank you. And we're about to wrap up, but we do have a lot of policymakers in the audience from Canada and around the world. So we'd like to turn to your recommendations to them, but we will need your Twitter-friendly soundbite in 1 or 2 sentences, 15, 20 seconds or less. What are your recommendations to policymakers? And we'll start with Bree, turn to Jesse, and finish with Jessica. So Bree, 1 or 2 sentences.
Okay, sure. I'd say rethinking common assumptions about forced migration. So no one conflict is the same. We have to consider how conflict has changed. We need to further understand the myriad root causes of displacement, the multiple interacting forms of migration. It's not just a well-founded fear of persecution, and a range of capacities and strengths that the affected populations have that we can draw upon. So not just food and shelter and healthcare, but also thinking about things like dignity and well-being.
Jesse.
All models of causality have normative presumptions built into them. We need to understand those. That is to say, we should not presume we know why people are doing things, but all models do have that, and all research has models. It seems to me we need more grounded research and more work on the questions of how to represent people in a way that they can shape the political economy that shapes their own entitlements. Not an easy order, but all you policymakers, do it, please. No.
Jessica, your words to policymakers.
Yeah, so maybe since I've been talking about the UN so much, maybe I can say one more thing about the Security Council and the resolutions that may sound like cheap talk, and probably in most cases they are, but there's also research showing that these resolutions can be consequential, and they're part of a set of diplomatic action that can be used to shape behaviors and incentives, especially for governments that don't want to be put at the spotlight. And so I think this may go back to the problem of preventing forced displacement to begin with. And I think the ambiguity and the soft language that the Security Council has been using in relation to the issue compared to the General Assembly, as I mentioned at the beginning, could be something that I think the UN and UN member states ultimately may want, I think, to consider, right, to ensure that there's an ambiguous condemnation and as a way to prevent this, while at the same time maybe thinking more carefully about whether we should keep multinational military contingents with tasks that maybe they're not really trained to carry out.
Excellent. That's all advice that's Twitter and policy friendly. And with that, that brings us to an end. So I'd like to thank all panelists for what I'm sure you'll all agree was a great discussion. We hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it. And we hope that everyone out there will join us next week for a look at Brexit and the future of Europe. So on behalf of myself and the Balsillie School, we thank you all for tuning in. Until next week, take care, stay safe, and stay healthy out there. Thank you.